Thanks to the Manchester and London attacks and the stabbing in Portland, there's been a lot of talk lately about both Islamic Jihadi terror attacks and white supremacist violence. Even before these specific incidents, these were big topics, with events from 9/11 and the Pulse shooting to Dylan Roof's murderous rampage, fueling a discussion over the dangers of both Islamic Jihadi terrorism and white supremacist or right-wing violence. Today we're going to find out which of these problems is worse. According to a series of articles in the mainstream media from 2015, prior to the Pulse nightclub shooting, there were twice as many murders committed by white supremacists as there were murders committed by Islamic jihadis in the US from 2002 to 2014, the years between 9/11 and the Pulse nightclub shooting, the two deadliest Islamic jihadi attacks in recent history. But keep in mind that this is in the US, where whites make up about 64% of the population, and Muslims make up only about 0.6% of the population, so there are roughly 100 times as many white people as Muslims in the US. If there are twice as many total white supremacist killings as Islamic jihadi killings, that means that each individual Muslim is about 50 times as likely to kill you over their religion as each white person is to kill you over their race. And keep in mind, these numbers ignore the Pulse shooting and 9/11, so they leave out the two biggest Islamic terror attacks of the last couple decades. The claim from the mainstream media that white supremacist violence is worse than Islamic terrorism was so weak that it took nothing more than basic demographic info and elementary school level math to debunk it. Perhaps because of this, left-wing ideologues in the media changed tactics and started to compare all right-wing violence against Islamic jihadi terror. When including anti-government attacks and Christian violence, they claim that there have been 7 times as many killings by right-wing terrorists as by Islamic terrorists. But again, this is based on data that leaves out 9/11 and the Pulse shooting. Even if their numbers weren't heavily cherry-picked, would this really mean that each right-wing American is more likely to kill you than each Muslim? Of course not. Just over 3/4 of Americans are Christian, while about 36% of Americans consider themselves to be conservative. It's hard to prove the exact percentage of Americans who are white, Christian, and conservative, but if you look just at the raw percentages and ignore the fact that members of each of these groups are more likely to be members of the others, we come up with about 17.5% of the US population who are white, Christian, and conservative. Comparing that against the number of Muslims in the US, there are about 30 times as many white conservative Christians in the US as Muslims. That would make each individual Muslim just over 4 times as likely to kill you over just their religion as white Christian conservatives are to kill you over their race, religion, and ideology combined. But the left has one more trick up their sleeve. Even though a few of the murders committed by both right-wing extremists and Islamic terrorists were committed and aided by women, they want to blame all right-wing terrorism on men. Even if we assume that all white Christian right-wing murders are committed by men, which they're not, and that Islamic jihadi murders can be committed by either sex, being as generous as possible and bending over backwards to give Muslims the benefit of the doubt while making conservative white Christian men look as bad as possible, Muslims are still more than twice as likely to kill you for their religion as right-wing white Christian men are to kill you over their beliefs. And remember, that's without including 9/11 or the Pulse nightclub shooting in those numbers. So if we were to go back and look at the total number of murders by terrorists over the past 25 years, going back that far so that we can also include the Oklahoma City bombing as an act of right-wing terrorism, that puts the total number of killings by Islamic jihadi terrorists at over 3,000, while the total number of murders committed by right-wing extremists is only a few hundred. That means that over the past 25 years, the average Muslim in the US was about 150 times as likely to murder you over their religion as the average white Christian conservative was to murder you over their race, religion, and ideology combined. Of course, since these kinds of attacks accounted for only a small portion of all murders and a tiny fraction of a percent of all deaths during that time, the argument can definitely be made that you shouldn't spend too much time worrying about dying in a terrorist attack, and plenty of people on the left have made that kind of argument in defense of Muslims. But keep in mind, if you're going to make that kind of argument, it applies 150 times as well to conservative white Christians, so don't believe the media's hype that you need to be worried about right-wing extremism in the US. And those numbers are pretty similar in Europe too, where about 450 people have been murdered by Islamic terrorists just since 2014, whereas right-wing extremist attacks are extremely rare. Now, Muslim apologists sometimes claim that Western imperialism or interventionism in the Muslim world is responsible for the much higher rates of terrorism committed by Muslims. But how much does that really explain the difference? America's recent history of involvement in the Middle East is complicated, and there have certainly been some missteps. In the 1950s, the U.S. overthrew a democratically elected and relatively progressive and secular government in Iran to install the Shah, a dictator who was later overthrown and replaced by theocratic fundamentalists. In the 1980s, the U.S. encouraged Saddam Hussein's militarism and pushed him into war with Iran, while selling weapons to both sides, and also funding militants in Afghanistan who later became al-Qaeda. U.S. interference in Middle Eastern politics was even part of Osama bin Laden's reasoning behind 9/11. The invasion of Iraq that followed was based on flimsy evidence that proved largely incorrect, and the aftermath of the war, as well as the war in Libya and the decision to arm rebels in Syria, led to the rise of ISIS. So there's definitely room to criticize the Western world for some of their actions in the Middle East that have done more harm than good. But that's only one part of the story. You see, the 70-year-long era of American dominance in world politics since the end of World War II has been the most peaceful era in all of human history. War-related deaths as a percentage of the world's population are the lowest that they have ever been for all of recorded history. So America's involvement in world politics may be doing more to prevent bigger and worse conflicts from occurring than people realize. And for all the blame that's sometimes heaped on the US for interfering in the Middle East, the era of American dominance was also the era when imperialism ended, giving Muslims more control over their own destiny than they'd had in a long time. Have Muslims used that opportunity to create more peaceful societies in their countries? Unfortunately, no, at least not compared to the US and Europe. Most Muslim-majority countries are run by violent dictators who oppress their own people, and aside from the Iranian coup in the 1950s, most of America's intervention in the Middle East has been against oppressive dictators. ISIS kills even more Muslims in the Middle East than Christians and Westerners through terrorism. There are 10 countries where homosexuality is punishable by death, and 9 of them have solidly Muslim populations, while Nigeria is about evenly split between Muslims and Christians. Muslim-majority countries have some of the biggest gaps between men and women's rights. Most of the countries that outlaw blasphemy and anti-religious speech are Muslim-majority countries. So Western liberals who think that they're fighting for tolerance and inclusivity by supporting Islamic immigration and refugee resettlement may want to think twice about the attitudes of the people that they're bringing into their countries. Blaming the West for imperialism in the Middle East makes no sense when you consider Islam's history. 1,000 years ago, during the glory days of the Islamic Caliphate, Muslims conquered all of Southeast Asia, North Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, Spain, and parts of India, and even attacked China. They took millions of slaves from Africa and Europe, and unlike the US, which has a large number of descendants of former freed slaves, there are almost no descendants of former slaves in the Middle East because most of them were worked to death and were not allowed to have children. Islamic imperialism and slavery were far more brutal than European and American imperialism and slavery. And while the West ended slavery themselves, Muslims did not end slavery until they were conquered by the West and forced to. And many of the good qualities of early Islam, like their respect for scientific inquiry as a way to better understand Allah's creation, are unfortunately missing from modern-day Islam. There are plenty of reasons, plenty of very valid reasons, to be concerned about the current wave of Muslim mass migration into Western countries. And the left-wing narrative that Islamic terrorism is somehow justified by Western imperialism only works if you want a more violent, oppressive, and intolerant world than the one we have today. As someone whose whole shtick is dressing up as Jesus and making jokes at Christianity's expense, I would much rather be surrounded by Christians who are a lot more likely to laugh and not get offended than be surrounded by Muslims who will kill you for mocking their prophet, as they did in the Charlie Hebdo attack, and as they've done to non-believers in many other countries. Wait a minute. Where's my sash? Aw, crap, I'm cosplaying Muhammad. Please don't kill me. Sorry about that. Look, it's fine to constructively criticize the West's foreign policy blunders, especially when you consider the Obama administration's role in causing the Syrian refugee crisis. But keep in mind that Islamic society needs far more constructive criticism than the West, and failing to criticize Muslims for their culture of violence and oppression will only prevent them from improving. So if you want a more peaceful and prosperous world where women are protected and have their rights respected, and where people with different beliefs and lifestyle choices can interact peacefully and constructively, you must be willing to stand up to people who want to use violence to impose their way of life on others. And right now that means standing up to Islamic terrorism and the Muslim mass migration attempt to take over Europe. Selectio Volt! Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something. If you'd like to help me continue my ministry, you can make a donation online at patreon.com/storytimewithjesus, Or if you'd like to make just a one-time donation, you can make that through PayPal at storytimewithjesus@gmail.com. But please, no more than 10% of your income. And have a blessed day.